Welcome to the Theological Lens, where our goal is to see the world, our daily walks, and our worship transformed by the truth of Jesus Christ. Our content is saturated with Scripture, overflowing with faith, and rooted in the good news of the cross. Each episode will proclaim the name of the Lord, calling us to submit to His ways and live lives that glorify Him. With hearts full of thankfulness, we'll explore how Jesus shapes everything, our decisions, our worldview, and our worship, always pointing back to the hope and transformation found in Him.
Welcome to the Theological Lens. My name is Dr. Buchanan. I'm so glad that you have joined me today. Today, we're going to talk about something that saturates nearly every part of our lives. It's music. It's in our homes, it's in our cars, it's in our earbuds, it's in our stores, and it's even embedded within our memories. We use it to celebrate and to grieve, to motivate, and to soothe. And as powerful as music is, it is not neutral. It forms us sometimes whether we recognize that or not. And it shapes our emotional experience and guides sometimes our thinking and our perspectives. So today we're going to explore the spiritual and psychological influence of music and how our musical choices are shaping our minds, our emotions, and even our theology. And this is why I think intentional moderation is a critical step for Christians in employing wisdom to direct the choices of our lives. So let's start with something that even the ancient philosophers understood, that music has moral weight. Plato once said the following: "Through foolishness, they deceived themselves into thinking that there was no right or wrong in music." He warned that when society loses its moral compass in art, that it's already on the road to collapse. And if you fast forward through a few centuries, the co-founder of communism, Vladimir Lenin, said this. He said, "One quick way to destroy a society is through its music." Now, neither of these men were Christians, but even they recognized that music shapes people's values and their behaviors and their beliefs. And that often happens without the individual's awareness of the manipulation that is taking place. In fact, when others might point out concerns about those influences, people often argue that terrible musical choices just don't affect them. And while that deflection is optimistic, according to researchers, it's actually just not even true. Both the philosophers and musicians themselves know it. Bono said this. He said, "Music can change the world because it can change people." And he didn't specify whether or not that change was going to be for good or for evil, but he's not wrong. How does it change us? Well, neuroscientists have been studying this for a long time, and they've come to some conclusions that I think are valuable for us to understand. They tell us that music activates the same brain regions as love, reward, and addiction. Lyrics paired with melody create emotional memory. You hear a song from your teenage years, and suddenly you're 14 again, and you might be heartbroken, rebellious, or desperately in love. Paul Simon said the following: "Songs are sneaky things. They can slip across borders and change minds." Sneaky, that's a good word. And in many ways, it is true because music often delivers mood and teaches values at the same time in the middle of a subconscious methodology. So the 1960s shaped values by giving us Imagine. This song had a beautiful melody, but it was a utopian dream that said there's no heaven and there's no hell and there's no religion. And then the 80s gave us I Used to Love Her, But I Had to Kill Her by Guns N' Roses. And let's not even talk about the 2020s that have given us the joys of hypersexualized songs, hyperviolent songs. It could be that the songs are just reflecting the values of the current culture. Or it could be that the arts, including music, play a substantive role in shaping the values of a culture. And if that's true, then we should be very concerned about much of modern music. Dr. Adam Niesty said this. He said, he's a musicologist, by the way. He said, "Music is a powerful drug. It can poison you, lift your spirits, or it can make you sick without knowing why." And that's why we can't treat music as just a matter of taste, because it's so much more substantive than that. And from a psychologist's standpoint, music has an almost unique quality, an ability to bypass our rational kind of filter and go straight into the limbic system, the emotional center of our brains. And that's why when you hear that song from the teenage years, your emotional center remembers before your cognitive awareness does. That's what takes you back. You feel what you felt then. Now, that emotional pull is not inherently bad, and God designed that. But because it's so powerful, then it can be either positive or wildly negative. And there's a ton of research that points to both potentials. So, first, let's talk about some of the positive aspects. Music can rewire the brain in some good ways. It isn't just like passive listening, it's an active shaper of brain structure and function. And studies show that it promotes some structural changes, especially in musicians, by strengthening some neural connections. So, for instance, a 2023 study highlighted that music's role in fostering neuroplasticity describes it activating regions like the temporal and frontal lobes from memory and emotions, and also pointed out that experienced musicians exhibit anatomical differences in their brains, such as thicker cortices, and that is linked to enhanced cognitive reserve. That means music is a really positive thing for our brain functioning. And the more that we get into the rhythms and understand music deeper, that's good for our thinking. That's a good thing. Prenatal exposure to music, for instance, correlates with better neural development in newborns. Like, we've known that for a really long time. Research in scientific reports used a brain scan, an fMRI, to scan listeners' brains during preferred music. And it revealed increased connectivity in the parts of the brain involved in self-reflection and emotion. And that suggests that music can play this huge role in amplifying emotional processing, help us work through things, and it may help to mitigate disorders like depression. It may lift mood. It may settle down PTSD by healing some disrupted networks in the brain's functioning. Longitudinal studies on music show that it enlarges the corpus callosum, which bridges the hemispheres of our brain, and it makes those hemispheres work more effectively together, which is increasing problem solving. It helps our brain work more effectively in the higher ordered thinking. That's pretty cool. Music can bypass the rational thought to directly activate the limbic system, and that's the brain's emotional center. And it triggers dopamine releases that can actually give us pleasure, and they can reduce stress. And by the way, research shows that effect is even more powerful when it's live. I mean, I found this amazing study that explains that live music versus recording, live music synchronizes listeners' brainwaves with the performers, training emotions in real time via the amygdala. And this social mental connection explains why concerts foster bonding and reduce anxiety more potently than listening to music on your own. That's kind of cool. Harvard Medical School has found that music creates tension and resolution patterns. And that has therapeutic implications because we experience the tensions, and music teaches us that tension can be resolved. That's a good thing. Music boosts executive functioning of memory, learning, and recall by syncing rhythms with brain oscillations and improving focus and memory. All of those effects are amplified by emotional or familiar tunes to us. Some of the studies in the New York Academy of Science linked pleasurable music to dopamine-driven memory gains, with brain scans showing frontal temporal activation. And here's what it really comes down to. Preferred music enhanced recall by somewhere between 20 to 30% in tasks, as in memory tasks. That's cool. One study tracked stroke patients, and it found that daily music listening improved verbal memory and cognition better than audiobooks because it created new neural growth. There were new pathways that were being created when they were listening to music that weren't being created when they were listening to audiobooks. That means that music is a much better therapeutic next step for stroke patients and people who are dealing with cognitive deficits. But beyond all of these wonderful potential positive outcomes in emotion and cognition, there's also an extensive body of research on all the potential negative outcomes. And they center in four main areas. The four main areas are negative emotions, encouragement of negative behaviors, which comes with a lot of music, an unhealthy mental focus, and then also shifting values. So, for instance, sad or emotionally charged music can actually trigger repetitive negative thinking patterns. We call it rumination. And I did a whole episode on that a few weeks ago. That can actually amplify and make much more challenging depressive kinds of symptoms. And in this case, music can actually reinforce low moods rather than lifting them or alleviating them. And there's lots of research on this, but I'll highlight two main studies on this. Number one, research from Manning's Children's Hospital in 2023 noted that teens that were using sad music to process emotions often experience affective harm, like worsening anxiety or depression. And that's pretty common. A lot of teenagers, when they're in just a negative state, they don't turn to the uplifting kind of stuff. They actually turn to music that turns out is going to make it worse, not help it. And another study with university students found that while music experiences could reduce negative emotions, exposure to certain sad pieces intensified guilt or hostility, even anger in some patients. So, what they've found is that these emotional influences, where it could have a positive impact, that there are times that the wrong music is producing dramatically more negative impacts. So, this is even linked to like risky behavior in adolescence. They've found that genres with aggressive, violent, or hypersexualized lyrics can normalize rebellion, self-harm, or risk-taking through social learning, through modeling, and identity formation, especially in peer-influenced subcultures. So studies have found that some music can contribute to increased substance use, eating disorders, and even cutting self-harm. And this seems to be in part due to the normalization and sometimes glorification of these kinds of behaviors. And I doubt when most people like pop in those earbuds that they're expecting to be affected in these kinds of ways. Modern artists understand this very, very well. Even Jimi Hendrix once said, "You hypnotize people to where they go right back to their natural state. And when you get people at their weakest point, you can preach into their subconscious what we want to say." And he was right, not in the true sense of hypnotism, but about the influence. The messages of songs, whether about identity or sex or power or rebellion or even despair, they are absorbed and they're repeated, and eventually they're internalized and believed. The same year that Jimi Hendrix said that, Life magazine published an interview with Frank Zappa, and he said this: "The loud sounds and bright lights of today's music are tremendous indoctrination tools." Zappa was certainly no friend to Christianity, but he understood that music conditions people. And it's a really subtle teacher, but it's an effective teacher. Eddie Manson later wrote, "Music can be as powerful as a drug and much more dangerous because nobody takes musical manipulation seriously." So, what are these messages that we're being manipulated to accept? It should be noted that there are many popular songs that contain good values, and some of those I really appreciate. I've always appreciated "You're Still the One" by Shania Twain, even though Shania Twain is not my favorite. I like the song "From the Front Porch Looking In," and when you hear me describe those two songs, you might think incorrectly that I love country music, and that's not actually true. But some of the country songs have good values of marriage and family, and the truth is there aren't too many genres that make room for that anymore. So I'm glad at least it's there. I totally appreciate so many of the songs by Ben Rector and his themes of friendship and family and love and commitment. They're beautiful, even though very few of them actually are overtly religious in their themes. They just have good themes. But the truth is, if we stop to examine the values of popular music through its lyrics, we would find that there's a lot more songs that defy God's ways than those that support it. And that isn't just a recent problem, because like sex outside of God's boundaries has been glorified across multiple generations of music. Fats Domino found his thrill on Blueberry Hill, and the Drifters were messing around under the boardwalk. And then Tina Turner questioned whether love needed to have anything to do with it. And modern music has left behind any sense of mystery or poetry, as Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion want to tell us more about themselves than we would ever like to know. But the value and the influence, that problem goes so far beyond just the grossly sexual. Materialism, rebellion, self-idolatry, nihilism, violence, addiction, the mockery of faith, and the glorification of the occult. That's all in there. I was doing research for a seminar on suicide and self-harm, and I came across a study that identified 674 songs that speak about suicide. They were trying to determine whether or not these songs were promoting it or discouraging it. And some of the conclusion they came to is that it's kind of open for interpretation on what those motives are. Like it wasn't clear enough for them to be sure whether or not it was glorifying it or it was discouraging it. Some of them certainly are glorifying it. And I think you could argue that a high frequency of exposure to these songs are at the very least normalizing suicide. They're making it something that's common and something that young people should be struggling with. Listening to these songs that preach against God's truth has a cost. And that cost might be one that we don't identify right away. In part because we refuse to admit music's power. As I worked with college students for decades, there were many times that I questioned the wisdom of somebody's musical choices, and I would pull them aside and say, help me understand that. How is that beneficial to you? And there were some predictable responses to that. Often people would say, I just like the music. I don't even pay any attention to the lyrics, or it just doesn't affect me. The words don't affect me. Yeah, but that's not the way it works. This stuff soaks into our brains and ends up impacting our hearts and shaping our behavior and our viewpoints. And that's what we have to keep in mind as believers. I'm not advocating that we reject all music that isn't played on K-Love. That's not what I'm saying. But we should be aware of music's power. And then we need to use wisdom to moderate and curate our musical choices. Proverbs 4:23 warns that we should, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Music can provide wonderful entertainment, and it can soothe difficult emotional moments, like when a young harp player is sent to King Saul to change his mood. Music can also be used to align our hearts with truth and to help us remember who God is and what he's done. Music is such a great gift. But sin distorts every good gift. The same rhythms that can express gratitude and joy and lift our hearts can also glorify rebellion and pride. So we ought to exercise caution and discernment about what we pipe through our ears and into our hearts and minds. Maybe that means that we reject some total bops because we recognize that they're pushing us in ungodly ways. And it may take time and effort to curate better playlists, to weed out songs that shouldn't be part of our musical diets. But since we tend to spend so much time soaking in music, then we ought to make wise choices about what we're marinating in. Listen, when I talk about moderating or curating our music, I'm not talking about legalism. I'm not talking about just avoiding everything. What I'm talking about is intentional formation, recognizing the potential influences and choosing the right ones while rejecting the wrong ones. Being very intentional and thoughtful about what we let form our souls. Romans 12:2 reminds us, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Music is one of the world's loudest patterns. And to renew our minds, we have to be intentional about the soundtrack that we choose for our hearts. And that's exactly why I think Christians must take music seriously. We can't separate the art from the artist, the beat from the belief, or the rhythm from the worldview. Prince once told Rolling Stone, everything we put out there is affecting people. The message matters. And if secular musicians recognize that, how much more should we, who are called to be the salt and the light? Intentional moderation of music doesn't mean that you only listen to hymns. It means you filter everything through discernment. And maybe there's some questions that you need to ask, like, what kind of emotion is this song cultivating? And it's not that every song has to be happy. There is a place for something that is centers our hearts in grief for the right reasons. But we need to ask the questions. What emotion is this song cultivating? And is that the right emotion for the moment? 2, what values are this song reinforcing? Because songs are preaching to us. They are teaching us. They are normalizing things. And we've got to question those values. And number 3, what worldview is it normalizing? What am I learning and become so comfortable with and accustomed to that I'm jaded and no longer surprised and no longer shocked? Because there's plenty of shocking stuff out there. As David Crosby once admitted, another musician, he said through his music, he could, quote, alter his audience's value system and, in effect, steal them away from their parents. He recognized that his music could counteract the lessons that parents had been trying to teach their kids. So we can't afford to be uncritical listeners in a world that knows exactly how to use music to shape our hearts. So here's some suggestions about intentional moderation. First, evaluate the message. Lyrics are critical, and they most often are not neutral. They preach, and they're either going to preach truth or they're going to preach deception. They're either going to support God's values or they're going to undermine them. Does this song glorify sin or grieve over it? Does it confuse moral lines? Does it stir lust or does it cultivate and celebrate love? Does it center selfishness and pride or does it look beyond the borders of the individual? Does it mock authority or does it honor what God honors? Those are important questions to ask. And then second, consider that emotional impact. Does the music stir up peace or unrest, joy or anger? There's a reason that David's harp calmed Saul. And there's a reason why some music stirs up anger and chaos in our spirits. Third, find the right balance. And I'm not saying that you can only listen to worship music. There's a good place for love songs and nostalgic considerations of times gone by. I can even appreciate walking in a winter wonderland. As we move towards Christmas, there are so many songs that are not uniquely of faith, but they are songs that warm our hearts and spirits during that time. And while those might make for a fun dessert, our musical diet probably needs more protein. Fill your life with music that feeds your faith. Let worship, scripture songs, and instrumental beauty reset your emotional tone. And then fourth, I think that we've got to protect the next generation. We've got to talk with the young ones around us about what they're listening to. Don't just ban music, train. Help them understand why certain music, certain messages, certain moods are dangerous to the soul. Helping them figure out how to choose wisely the hours of listening is a gift to their hearts and their minds. So moderation isn't about abstinence, it's about stewardship. Music is one of God's great gifts, a language that touches both heart and spirit. But like every gift, Satan wants to corrupt it and use it to tear us down. It is worth the work to redeem it and guard it. So let's not be people who deceive ourselves into thinking there's no right or wrong in music, like Plato warned. But let's be people who recognize the sacred weight of sound. When we choose music that aligns with truth, we invite God's presence. When we allow distortion, we dull our discernment. So let's be intentional. Let's curate a soundtrack that glorifies the one who gave us the ability to sing in the first place. And coming soon is an episode where I'm going to talk about the role of music in our worship of God. Thanks for joining me today on The Theological Lens. And if this episode was a blessing to you, would you like it, subscribe, share it with others? And let's keep the conversation going in the comments below about how we can live wisely in a world that is full of noise. So until next time, grace and peace to you.
If you enjoyed what you just heard, we invite you to like the episode and, if possible, leave a positive review. If you know someone who could benefit from this content, please share it on your social media. We also ask that you subscribe and follow so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. We are so glad that you chose to be with us today. We hope that you will join us again next week on The Theological Lens.